Great, thank you. And a very warm welcome to the first session of the NHS Innovation Life Science Commission programme of work for 2023. My name is James O'Shaughnessy. I am a senior partner at Newmarket Strategy and a former health minister, and together with Mike Buick, we chair this commission together. And I'm delighted to welcome fellow commissioners Keith Ridge, Jill Lane and Richard Stubbs, who will be joining me this morning for our discussion. And in this discussion, as you know, we are following up from the successful launch of our 2022 report with explorations this year into a number of therapeutic areas of unmet need. And first of all, we are taking on what a biggie, neurodegeneration, dementia, Alzheimer's. And in doing so, we'll be holding a series of panels of this kind, as well as other research and events, in order to understand the state of the field, to look ahead to the future, to see what potential is out there to be realised scientifically, as well as in care, in diagnostics, and a range of other areas, in order to set forward some practical ideas about how the better diagnosis, treatment, care of dementia patients could be provided in the UK. And in doing so, delighted to be supported as ever by Curia, as well as by Eli Lilly, Roche and the Alzheimer's Societies, although the views of the commissioners as ever will be our own. So in this session today, we are very fortunate to have two panels. In the first hour, we will be exploring diagnosis and diagnostics. In the second, looking towards treatment and care. The intention is for us to, as commissioners, to ask a series of questions once our panelists have introduced themselves and have given an initial 2 minutes where they will give their view on the state of the field. And as I said, we will then follow up that with questions. Please do use the chat, participants. I know there's a number of you who have joined, and delighted to see you all. If you want to use the chat to have a conversation go along on the side, that's great. We will dip in and out of it as we can as commissioners, in order to look for inspiration for our questions, although we do have some set piece questions that we do want to ask and have briefed the panelists on in advance. There aren't, unfortunately, direct opportunities to ask questions, but we will try and reflect what's going on in the chat to the extent that we can. And as I said, the purpose of the commission was set up to come up with practical ideas for how to solve knotty problems in critical areas of health and life science delivery. We are very much interested in solutions rather than just restating problems, and we're also interested in how to scale ideas as well as how to introduce new ones, and so hopefully that theme will come out in the discussion we have today. But without further ado, in fact, sorry, there is one piece of housekeeping, which is, of course, that this is being broadcast and recorded, so just so everybody is aware. So without further ado, I'm going to quickly ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to come back round the wall again to ask them to do their 2 minute opening statements, and then we'll move into questions from the commissioners. So perhaps I could start with you, Professor O'Brien.
Hello, everyone. John O'Brien. So I'm Professor of Old Age Psychiatry in Cambridge, and I have a role with NIHR as the National Specialty Lead within the Clinical Research Network.
Thank you. Professor Brown? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt Brown. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for Genomics England, and I'm a Professor of Medicine at King's College London. By background, I'm a physician, although I practice in rheumatology, and I've been a researcher of human genetics for about 30 years or so.
Thank you. Professor Sarwar?
Thanks, James. I'm Nadeem Sarwar. I'm the co-chair of the UK Dementia Mission. That was announced recently. I'm also an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh, and I've worked in a number of pharmaceutical companies, most recently at ASI.
Thank you. And Dr. Bozeat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sasha Bozeat. I work as one of the global medical directors for Alzheimer's disease at Roche. I'm working in Zurich at the moment, but I'm British, as you can tell probably from my accent, and have quite some experience working in the UK as well. So looking forward to discussion today.
Great, thank you. Right, over to you, panelists. I'm going to come to you, John, first to give your opening statement, and then go to Matt, Nadeem, and Sasha before we open up to questions. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So with regard to diagnosis, where are we at the moment? Well, today we diagnose dementia, which is a late stage condition, and we talk about a timely diagnosis. And we know from figures we're diagnosing less than 2/3 of people in the UK with dementia, and even fewer than that will get the right diagnosis, as in the type of dementia. So looking forwards, we would like to see emphasis more on early diagnosis and a shift from talking about timely diagnosis, I think, to early diagnosis. And that will come hand in hand with new therapies that are coming through the pipeline. I think type of diagnosis is important. And I use the word type, not subtype, which we might want to come back to, because we want to move more to pathophysiology. And the sort of granularity of how much detail we need with regard to pathophysiology will depend on therapeutics. So if we have an anti-tau treatment, we'll want to know if people have tau. If we have other treatments, we'll want to know they have that kind of pathology. It's important that in moving to early diagnosis, we combine that with appropriate support and guidance and care pathways for people, because this is a serious diagnosis, being told you've got early Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. Currently, what happens is the person or someone close to them notices a problem, goes to the GP, then you go to a hospital, sort of memory clinic, to see a specialist. I don't see that particular pathway dramatically changing, although, you know, others may have different views. But I think what will change is the way some of these problems come to light. The greater awareness, greater use of you know, apps and other forms of data, maybe to spot there's a problem. I think the GP will still be an essential point in terms of the signposting. When people get to specialist services, I think the biomarkers will be much more important, and these are moving rapidly from sort of imaging to CSF to blood biomarkers. I think in specialist care, there needs to be greater working, and there should be, between old age psychiatry, neurology and geriatric medicine to give that kind of holistic diagnosis. And I think that imaging CSF and bloods will be important, maybe other bodily fluids as well. The diagnostics we've got developing are not absolute, you know, probably 80%, 70, 80%, 85% accuracy. So this kind of specialist diagnosis and assessment of information is, I think, going to remain critical unless we get some very dramatic advance in diagnostics. So just in summary, sort of the move particularly towards the availability of therapies will lead to sort of earlier diagnosis and much more linked to pathophysiology with greater use of biomarkers. But that sort of post-diagnostic support is going to remain increasingly important. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Very interesting, and lots of topics there which we'll pick up on. Matt.
I'm off mute this time. It's well known that Alzheimer's disease is quite heritable. Exactly how heritable is uncertain, and is really critical about the question about whether genomics is going to be useful for population screening or for individual diagnoses. So if you study a heritability in twins, we get an upper estimate of heritability of around 80%, which would suggest that we should be able to do population screening and early genetic diagnosis. But if you look at less biased methods of looking at heritability using apparently unrelated cases and controls estimates, so then are around about the 10 to 15% heritability figures, which would suggest that it's probably not going to be quite so useful. It's also important to understand just the basic genetic structure of the heritability. That is, that there are some major genes that have high risk, like ApoE4, where a single variant is associated with an increased risk of around about 15 times, but it is itself quite rare and so therefore not useful for population screening, versus the majority of people with Alzheimer's disease who have what's called a polygenic risk for the disease, which involves literally thousands to tens of thousands of genetic variants that are involved in the risk of the disease. So polygenic risk scores, which take into account thousands of genetic variants and capture the polygenic component of heritability, have reasonably good discriminatory value in Alzheimer's disease, and good enough that they may be able to be used in using early diagnosis, particularly for clinical purposes, and I think likely in combination with other biomarkers. They could also be useful for enriching clinical trials for early intervention studies in people who are at high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease to look at preventative methods. They are not good enough for population screening. There are lots of uncertainties about them. For example, their performance in people of different ancestral groups, because they've all been developed in people of white European descent. And there's also not a lot of data about their performance at different age and in relation to carriage or non-carriage of ApoE4. So lots of research to be done, but potential there. Very
interesting. Thank you. I think this question about the feasibility of screening might be something we return to, the uncertainties around that. Thank you, Nadeem, and then Sasha.
Thanks, James. Just to provide some context that I'd relate who we are to some other diseases. So I remember in the 90s reading with envy about rapid progress in cardiometabolic diseases, the discovery of new medicines that could alter lipids or blood pressure, together with national screening programs to find people at risk, transform the way we prevent cardiovascular diseases. Over the last decade or two, the way we think about cancer similarly has transformed. Our knowledge about the underlying pathogenic drivers of the disease, allowing precision medicines, immuno-oncology, and other real game-changing innovations to arrive. This is now our time. I feel a similar inflection when it comes to neurodegeneration. I think that's the kind of breakthrough we can now anticipate for neurodegenerative diseases over the next 5 to 10 years. So can we aspire, and we should aspire, to prevent neurodegenerative diseases like we prevent cardiometabolic diseases and treat neurodegenerative diseases like we treat cancer? And to get there, I think it's going to be 3 key breakthroughs or areas of progress that we need. The science, that I'll come to in a minute, entrepreneurship, and implementation. So in terms of science, and I think this is where the UK can really take the lead, I believe the triangle of what I call humanomics, so that's genomics plus all the other omics, data sciences, including advanced analytics, AI, machine learning, and digital technologies, including things that can be done at scale globally. I think that triangle can transform the way we have the underpinning science needed to realize a new paradigm for neurodegenerative therapeutics. In terms of entrepreneurship, I think recent breakthroughs will stimulate investment in this area that historically has been underinvested in. And I think the opportunity for substantial breakthroughs now will stimulate increased public and private sector investment in this area. And then finally, implementation. It's all very well innovating in biomarkers, screening technologies, and therapeutics. You have to turn them into medicines that people can actually receive. So I think that those 3 areas, the science, the entrepreneurship, and the implementation, really have brought us to at the cusp of a new era of therapeutics.
Fantastic, thank you. And no doubt big topics for your mission that you're chairing as well, Nadeem. Sasha.
Thank you. So I began my career 25 years ago working in a memory clinic in Cambridge, running neuropsychological tests on individuals seeking a diagnosis. And despite great advances in our understanding of the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's and other dementias, significant advances in biomarker technology, it pains me to say that most people, I think, are still experiencing the diagnostic process in the same way that we did it then. And we've heard already very clear and eloquently from John, description about how that takes place. Of course, there are some caveats, there are some exceptions. People presenting a little bit younger with an atypical presentation might have access to biomarkers in the UK, but generally that's the exception, I think, rather than the rule. I think, so I think we can do a lot better than we're doing. We have made progress, I think, in terms of addressing stigma. I think people are coming forward earlier. I think there's better understanding that dementia is not a normal part of aging. I think GPs are getting better at referring people on. We did some market research not long ago, and we found that actually GPs tend to refer more people forward, and it tends to happen earlier, which is fantastic. What we need to do is actually provide them with the right tools, quick and easy assessments that enable them to make those judgments and move forward at the right time. And I believe that we've got those technologies coming through with blood-based biomarkers now that we can really streamline the diagnostic pathway. I think it really comes down to what Nadeem was saying about implementation. For me, the technologies are already here. The technologies that we could really use to improve the pathway are here. We're just not implementing them into clinical routine. So I think this is really where the discussion needs to be focused. there are some developments which will come forward, which will help us, but let's implement what we've got first in order to be able to make them work for us.
Great, thank you, Sasha. That's exactly the kind of practical line of inquiry that we appreciate. So we will definitely bear that in mind. So we're just going to move on now to the questions, but as we do, it's worth reminding everybody, not that everyone on this call needs reminding, I'm sure, about why we have turned our attention to this subject. Up to 1 million people predicted to have dementia by 2025. With all the implications that has on individuals, their families, care system, and of course the wider economy. It's already costing it's estimated around £26 billion a year to the UK economy, the sheer cost of dementia in all its forms. And of course that cost is always borne, as is often the case with healthcare issues, unequally. And so as we look to solutions, we're not only looking, of course, at the exciting science, and we'll come to that in a minute, but we are thinking about how to flow through the more everyday changes that can be made today into health systems, and of course to make sure that they are available in such a way that everybody can take advantage of them. So that's the kind of backdrop to what we're exploring. What I'd like to start with, and maybe I can go in now reverse order after people gave their statements, is we want to start with the big picture. So when we were talking about this as a commission, we were thinking about the right way to get into the subject. And what we thought was it's tempting to kind of think about what we could do tomorrow. And it's also quite exciting to think about what might happen in 10 years. Well, we sort of want to do both. We want to think about what the long term might look like, the really exciting potential, think about the barriers today, and then try to help contribute to the mapping and delivering a journey between the two. So we are starting off with the kind of what I call the tomorrow's world end of the picture. We want to start there about the big exciting future that's coming. So I wonder if I could ask each of the panelists if you could explain to us what you believe or what you hope will be true of dementia diagnosis, treatment and care in 10 years' time. And then if you want to also touch upon, maybe if you want to, specific technologies or treatments or whatever it is that are coming down the path, as well as what it might take to deliver them. Now, I know that's a lot to ask, but we do want to start with that kind of hopeful long-term picture so that we can address what we've heard of sometimes some of the sort of helplessness about whether this is even a tractable problem, and actually having some optimism about the long term could help, we believe, to change that culture. So, Sasha, if I could start with you and then come to Nadeem, Matt and John.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would really like to see people being able to receive a diagnosis at a time that is right for them. I think we talk a lot about timely diagnosis, and I think it's a good term. I agree, John, that we should be thinking earlier. But what I like about the term timely is I think it takes into account the right of that individual. The time might be right for some individuals in the early symptomatic phase. For some people, it might be slightly later. For other people with a family history, with increased risk, it might be even earlier. But I do think that's a personal choice of people. What I think we need to move towards is people being able to get that diagnosis, within a reasonable time frame, so that they're not pillar to post with various different HCPs and back out into community and back again. In the Netherlands, at one of the memory centres, individuals will go in and they'll have a full day's workup. And almost at the end of that day, they'll have scanning and full workup and everything. And almost at the end of the day, a diagnosis can be made. I think that doesn't really happen in the UK. I think there's a lot of toing and froing with different visits. So I think cut that right down for people so that they haven't got that anxious time of waiting. I would really love it if we could stop using the word dementia, actually, because I think it's very highly stigmatized. I think it's become a bit of a catch-all term. And at the end of the day, dementia is a term for a symptomatology, and should not be an excuse for not diagnosing somebody with the cause of their symptoms. So I think we need to understand what the cause is, diagnose the cause at the time that's right for the individual. And of course, as Nadeem mentioned, prevention is always going to be better than cure. And we know a certain number of cases could be prevented. So intervening early and with lifestyle modification and education early is also key, I think.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, so someone again said to us in a sort of preparatory work, dementias, not dementia, and even that is probably a simplification. But yeah, that's a point really well made. And Nadeem.
So if I just building on what Sasha was saying, if I divide tomorrow's world into two, what I think are distinct buckets, the first being to treat, manage, maybe even reverse, who knows, cure disease, separate from what I call the 3 Ps: predict, prevent, protect. Yep. So thinking about treatments first, 10 years from now, what I hope and see is that instead of trying to make medicines for dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, instead we'll make medicines for mechanism X or mechanism Y or mechanism Z, like we do for cancer. Because we know that some of those causal driver pathologies are common to many neurodegenerative diseases or subsets of neurodegenerative diseases. So in the future, can we have an era where we have medicines for tauopathy, TDP-43opathy, alpha-synucleinopathy, et cetera, and their combinations. And in addition, the modalities that can target those pathologies. So today, we have a lot of medicines that are monoclonal antibodies. Coming down the pipeline are antisense oligonucleotides, small molecules, gene therapies, RNA targeting therapies. The pharmacological toolbox we now have really was sci-fi as recent as 5 to 10 years ago. And so I see considerable hope for mechanism-based multimodality therapeutics that will be able to treat, manage, and maybe even reverse disease. On the predict, prevent, and protect side, I think that's where we have to really leverage scalable technologies. I think that's where thinking creatively about how can we really exploit what digital technologies combined with advanced analytics can realize, including for those who currently have very little access to imaging or CSF or other technologies that are somewhat restricted to those who happen to have access to them. And then being able to intervene not only pharmacologically, but with, again, any way that can help mitigate excess risk of disease, including lifestyle, societal, and digital. So I'd think about things in those two distinct categories. And if we do that, I can see a future where we can predict disease accurately as well as treat it mechanistically.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nadeem. Really helpful way of splitting the problem. Matt.
So I'm going to focus on just the early diagnosis aspect. So in genomics, there's been a progressive shift from whole genome sequencing being a research tool to being something that increasing proportions of the population are actually being studied. Genomics England is currently doing a pilot of sequencing newborns with a view to potentially newborn sequencing being available as a routine service on the NHS. And we see at the other end the future of whole genome sequencing amongst older populations being the next area to target, both for pharmacogenomics and also for polygenic risk scores to diagnose and predict early onset of various common diseases, of which one could potentially be different forms of dementia. So we think that given that the costs of whole genome sequencing are dropping so rapidly, with the laboratory cost of it falling by a factor of 5 over the last couple of years, 2 years. So it's now down to around $200 for a whole genome sequence, and likely to fall much further than that. So we're expecting it will get down to the region of $50 to $100 by the next 5 years. At that point, it will be quite feasible financially to screen the whole population. And that would then give us the possibility to, going back to Nadeem's point about having an affordable, scalable approach for screening, to be able to identify, firstly, all of the group, the relatively large group of people who have high penetrant variants which cause severe diseases like ApoE4, which is present in about 15% of the population, or the genes which are involved in frontotemporal dementia and some of those subtypes of dementia, for which we think that there are going to be gene-based therapies which are going to be available much earlier than for polygenic common background dementia. And then if the next question, I guess, is it ethical for us to actually be telling people that they've got genetic risk of dementia unless we have treatments available for them? So I'm hoping that within 10 years that we would actually have treatments and interventions which make a difference, that would justify us ethically in using genomics to be able to identify people early or before they've actually developed symptoms of getting dementia, so that they could then have those interventions.
Very helpful. Thanks, Matt. John.
Well, I'd like to see both prevention and better treatments. With regard to prevention, I'd like that to go further than the currently established, vascular risk factors, important though they are, because we're quite well geared up to manage a lot of those, hypertension, diabetes, obesity. We might be failing at some of them, but I mean, they're population-based strategies that are good for all sorts of things. So I'd like to see greater emphasis on dementia-specific prevention. There might be environmental things like hearing loss, for example, has recently emerged as a possible one. But ideally, we'd have, the statin equivalent for lowering amyloid, because the one thing we have learned about all the dementias, but particularly Alzheimer's disease over the last few years, is that it's not a disease of late life, it's a disease of middle life. And it takes 20 to 30 years, maybe 40 years to develop. So there are things we can be doing during that period to prevent cases. So I think that's where I'd like to see us move. But recognizing that whatever strategies we have for prevention, we're still going to have an awful lot of cases because of that longevity. And where there hasn't been much investment or interest lately is in the kind of more symptomatic treatments once people get Alzheimer's disease. It's great to see this focus on biomarkers and early treatments, which I'm all fully supportive of, but we also need to remember what happens to people when they get their dementia. How are we going to manage that? How are we going to improve quality of life for them and their carers? And just finally, in the shorter term, and it comes to something Sasha said, I mean, there is a lot of good stuff we know we should be doing. And there's variability, and everyone says, oh, well, there's always variability in the health service. But I wonder if people realise how striking it is. So Royal College of Psychiatrists National Audit, published 2022, so last year, included 71 trusts, so very representative. And memory services were using imaging to the variable extent that some services were using it 0% of the time, and some were using it 97% of the time.
Wow.
Now that just cannot be right. We shouldn't accept that, particularly when we have good, nice guidance, evidence-based on what we should be doing. And final statistic, CSF biomarkers, again, NICE recommended, 56% of memory services didn't have access to them. So the majority of memory services don't have access to evidence-based diagnostics. And we can change that in the short term, and we should.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something we'd really like to get into, and what existing national programs could be used to address that variability. Well, thank you all for those statements. The responses to the question, really helpful. I'm going to pass over to Keith now, who's going to lead on the next question.
Okay, thanks, James, and thanks everybody for that useful start and the vision you're offering, which is quite reassuring. Yeah, so on diagnostics and diagnosis, when you're sort of exploring the pipeline of future dementia diagnostics, what advancements should researchers and innovators be prioritising, and why? And perhaps, John, if we go back the other way this time, do you want to start that?
Sure, thanks. Well, I think we shouldn't accept that we've got current diagnostics where we want them. So, I mean, the point's already been made about the influence of age and representativeness of populations, and that's really, really important. So we've got to study the performance of these biomarkers in the sort of real world. I think the blood-based biomarkers have huge attractions because, I mean, it's so much easier to take a blood sample than to get a spinal tap or have a brain scan, and a lot sort of cheaper. So I think investment and interest in developing those further, now we have exquisitely sensitive ways of measuring these things, is important. A recent advance that's I think could be clinically implemented fairly soon are some of the new assays for alpha-synuclein, so for sort of Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia, because what we can't forget is the dementias that are not Alzheimer's disease, because if we're going to move things forward, and a lot of the emphasis at the moment is about Alzheimer's disease, we've got to be able to diagnose and have therapeutics for the other big causes of dementia, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. And these sort of amplification assays are able to detect some abnormal alpha-synuclein at the moment in CSF, so they require lumbar puncture, but things are moving and it might be possible in other more accessible tissues as well. And they're looking very promising, sort of 90% accurate. So I think that's an exciting area, and hopefully we'll soon get similar assays for TDP 43 and things for frontotemporal dementia. And then it's really about it's validation, representativeness, and then implementation.
Matt?
Well, of course, I'm going to say that that the research and application ought to go into genetics biomarkers, but I'll declare a conflict of interest there. But I'm going to say it's the only biomarker which is present before the onset of disease. So if you truly want to get an early diagnostic or predictive biomarker, none of the other omics or imaging biomarkers have the possibility of doing that. It's also potentially very low cost because you're doing it across basically every disease. It's not just a test for Alzheimer's disease. And in terms of being the samples being easily accessible, well, you can do it on a salivary sample or a blood sample, both of which are, of course, easily accessible. So the research things that need to be considered. So one is that I think everybody would agree that the current bucket term of Alzheimer's disease is actually probably multiple different diseases, and certainly dementia is multiple different diseases. And I'm sure that we can do much better in terms of subclassifying these, and therefore from that you'd actually end up with much better genetic predictors. Second thing I'd raise is that the ancestry question that I've mentioned before, because clearly this goes across all ancestries, and that's not something that's largely been addressed, although genetics is getting to it and addressing it now pretty actively. And the last two things I'd say are, firstly, that genomics goes together with imaging really well in other disease areas. So, for example, in cancer, multimodal testing using a combination of genetic testing and imaging or histopathology is far more informative about the likely prognosis of the cancer and its treatment response. And it's very likely that combinations of imaging genetics will be more powerful for Alzheimer's disease. And similarly, multi-omics things are bringing genomics together with the other protein and other biomarkers that are in development that John mentioned is likely to also be a very productive area of research and result in better early diagnostics, although of course they wouldn't be useful for predictive because the multi-omics tests will only be positive once somebody has actually got the disease.
So it's not all about biomarkers. There's more to it, because what we've heard, including today to some extent, is that biomarkers, I guess, is sort of top of the list, preferably from blood or more accessible body fluids. Then, but it's not just that. Is that right? You said imaging.
Yes. So imaging is, I think, plays a significant role, particularly in early diagnosis. The genomics biomarkers will do much better where there's a significant prior probability that the disease is actually true, that the person actually has the condition that you're talking about. That's true of any biomarker, not just genomics. And so for all of these biomarkers, actually we need to bring them in combination, not just with imaging and the other biomarkers, but also with clinical aspects to come up with an overall posterior probability that somebody actually has the condition you're talking about. At the moment, these sort of single test-based or just clinical diagnoses are clearly not good enough. The genetic testing cohorts report basically a roughly 80% diagnostic accuracy in the carefully curated research data sets for Alzheimer's disease, which suggests that in clinical settings, the diagnostic rate's probably less accurate than that.
Okay. Nadeem?
Thanks, Keith. So maybe one practical way to think about this is what could be successful and scalable. And I think scalable is a really important thing to bear in mind. And I believe a kind of accelerated diagnostics funnel where I see genomics, blood-based measurements, and digital technologies could achieve that, and most importantly, achieve that potentially in someone's home, as opposed to in a specialist clinic. One practical thing to bear in mind is currently a lot of the measurements we do are PET images, MRI images, CSF testing. Doing an MRI scan in a 70-year-old person who may have Alzheimer's is a really traumatic thing for that person to undergo. And getting that person to the scanning center usually requires one of their caregivers, often a loved one, taking a day off work and taking them there. sometimes repeatedly because the test isn't successful. So flipping that around and thinking, well, what can we do in an accurate and scalable way in people's homes, I think could be truly transformative. And I think that's where this kind of diagnostics funnel of population level genomics, blood, and digital screening. Now, of course, they probably won't be as accurate off the bat as some of the more advanced techniques that do involve imaging, but they could probably identify people quite well that could then be prioritized for subsequent testing or not. Combining that with a mechanism-driven view of the world, I think, is equally important. And I like to think of at least what I call the big six: A beta, tau, neurofilament light, alpha-synuclein, TDP43, microglia. These are mechanisms that likely have a causal involvement in multiple neurodegenerative diseases, not just Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And therapeutically, those are the mechanisms that we're trying to target. So I really like to think about that kind of Venn diagram, the simplistic diagnostics funnel that could be done at home, and at least the big six mechanisms that we're trying to modulate.
So a good chunk of Sasha's one-day work up in the Netherlands, you think in due course will be done or should be done in someone's home?
Absolutely. And again, to James's point about accessibility, we cannot develop solutions that are only accessible by those who happen to have access to those technologies and medicines or can afford them. Whereas being able to, within 30 minutes at home, take a saliva swab, take a blood test, and play a game on an app. If that really can reasonably accurately identify people who are at least are at a higher risk or suspicion of having neurodegenerative disease, that would help a lot. At the moment, when we try and do Alzheimer's trials, we have something called a screen failure, which is the number of people we screen before we can recruit someone into a trial. Currently, typically, we screen around 80 people to recruit one person into a trial. Those other 79 people, we've done PET scans, MRI scans, blood tests, CSF tests, etc., for no particularly useful reason. So yeah, I think that simplistic at-home diagnostic funnel could change the way we screen and treat dementias.
Okay. I'm conscious we've got quite a lot more to get through, James. So Sasha, do you have any quick comments to add to what's already been said on that?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I really share Nadeem's vision, I think, of, harnessing the power of technology to triage individuals through the diagnostic pathway. And I think that the wearables, this kind of passive monitoring of changes in gait and changing in eye movement has got tremendous potential for the future. We're not there yet, but blood-based biomarkers are here. John made some good points about how these need to be properly validated in the cohorts that they're going to be used. But I think it's about using blood-based biomarkers early, early in the diagnostic pathway, and digital at home to actually tell people when they should be seeking the advice of a healthcare professional. And then we can reduce the unnecessary, invasive procedures, expensive procedures like CSF and PET.
Thanks very much.
Matt, I see you got your hand up. Could I ask, you got a brief point to make?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to John's point about clinical trials, that using polygenic risk scores to stratify people and recruit them into clinical trials is a really effective way of reducing screen failures. And that's something we could do right now with the current PRSs. Terrific,
thank you. Jill, you want to take the next question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting listening to what you've been saying. And I guess everyone's talking about predicting dementia earlier, diagnosing earlier, and having treatments that then match a much more specific diagnosis. So let's hope we can achieve that all in 10 years' time. And now I want you all to think about your visions that you've set out for 10 years' time and give me an answer about the strategies and collaborations that the UK should be pursuing so that we can achieve that vision, and think about that in the context of dementia research and innovation. So what strategies and collaborations should we be pursuing so that we can develop those new diagnostics, biomarkers, all the things that we've been talking about? And instead of going for one end or the other, I'm going to go to the middle of the group and start with you, Nadeem, if that's okay. So strategies and collaborations.
Thanks, Jill. So I am very biased here as the co-chair of the UK Dementia Mission, because that's essentially what we are thinking about doing. And the UK Dementia Mission is modeled on the COVID mission that was successfully led by Dame Kate Bingham and delivered in an unprecedented timeframe vaccines to eradicate, hopefully, a disease, let alone prevent it. So learning from there, the Dementia Mission requires multi-sector partnership and bringing together government, industry, clinical practice with pharmaceutical technology and other companies. So I think it's compulsory we think about multi-sector solutions. The second thing that I often think about is trust. So often we talk about accessing all the technologies we spoke about, essentially are underpinned by data, and usually people's data, their health data, their digital data, their genomic data. And we need to make sure people trust us with their data. So what can we do? How can we clearly and transparently articulate to people how we plan on using their data, what will happen to it, and what are the solutions that'll come from it? So I believe in terms of models of solutions, those two things have to be paramount. Multi-sector partnerships, much like the COVID mission and hopefully the Dementia Mission, and trust and transparency. So the British public want the solutions we're trying to deliver and are confident about the way we're doing it.
Thank you. That's really helpful in relation to trust. It kind of underpins everything, doesn't it? We might come to it in the second part of today's discussion. Who shall I go to next? Sasha.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think there's sort of two focus areas, really. It should be firstly about collaborating to validate these existing and novel technologies. We've heard already about blood-based biomarkers. They tend to be validated in this very well characterized retrospective cohort. We don't know how they're going to perform in clinical practice is the honest answer. And companies need to have access to clinical cohorts in order to be able to see how these are going to perform, what cutoffs can be used, and really to ensure that they could be implemented into clinical routine. The second focus area, I think, is really about guidelines. I mean, at the end of the day, I think healthcare professionals follow guidelines. And I think that, it's holding us back, the fact that we don't have confirmatory biomarker as part of clinical routine in guidelines, that there isn't clear guidelines for managing, identifying MCI. So I think these are areas where we could really focus on collaborating to develop the evidence needed to give confidence in guideline development.
And I could talk for the next hour about guidelines, but it's good to hear you reference them, and a key part of collaboration could well be with the guideline developers and supporting them to do more rapid updates. Who shall I go to next? John, please.
Thanks. Well, I think it's about obviously international collaboration. So a lot of scientific knowledge will depend on data, it'll depend on cohorts, and it's seeing what's out there and what some of the gaps are. So there are big international cohorts, and they each have something to offer, but they don't tell the whole story. So it was because of certain gaps. For example, we set up the Prevent Dementia study about a decade ago, which is looking at middle-aged people at risk of future dementia, because there weren't any cohorts looking at that. And of course, now we have things like blood biomarkers. We now have samples, and we have data from cohorts that we can quickly look and see how those perform. So I think having these kind of long-term cohorts is actually very, very important. Biobank's been hugely helpful, but it doesn't answer everything because it's not particularly dementia specific. So I think it's seeing where some of the gaps are and trying to fill those. That's important. Multi-sector working, again, I mean, we've got some good examples of that, I think, with the Dementia Platform UK, which is an industry MRC collaboration that brings together big data and experimental medicine. So it's building on successes like that. The Clinical Research Network, we've also got the Dementia Translational Research Collaboration, of course, which has early kind of trials as its focus and will be an integral part of the Dementia Mission. So I think it's playing to strengths here and looking where we can collaborate with others. I know you don't want to talk about NICE too much, Jill, but just to agree very much with what Sasha says. So this change in terminology from dementia to type of dementia is critical across the whole sector. We don't have a nice cancer guideline. We shouldn't really have a nice dementia guideline, but that's what we have. It was a huge amount of work. Took 3 times as long as it kind of should have done. We need guidelines for Alzheimer's disease. We need guidelines for mild cognitive impairment. That will really not only bring the evidence together to inform practice, but it'll identify kind of research framework as well for key questions to be answered. And I think that's really, really important. So I'd strongly argue for that.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, it was a huge bit of progress at the time, the dementia guideline, but you're right, the world's evolving quite quickly. Just, you mentioned a number of existing collaborations. Are there any significant players missing from that we need to think about?
So I think there's the lack of dementia specific cohorts in midlife that I think will be needed to answer some critical questions. So I do think that's still a gap. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And Matt.
So I'd like to see some of these multi-partner collaborations looking at combinations of omics and genomic markers at a community level in the UK, so that they're relevant to our populations, our environment, and our healthcare system. At the moment, there is a large-scale polygenic risk score program in the UK called Our Future Health, which is studying 5 million Britons over the next, I think it's 3 to 4 years now that they've got left, of which dementia is one of the diseases that's listed as one of the areas that they're working on. But it's not something which is specifically or particularly focused on dementia. And I think by bringing that together with other large-scale omics programs and dementia research programs, we could do an awful lot in the next few years that's largely already funded and would bring together academics and commercial groups to try and come to a better place fairly quickly about multi-omic diagnosis.
Thanks very much. A practical suggestion there. I think I've been around everyone, so I'm going to now pass on, I think, to Richard.
Yes, thank you, Jill. Just to give James a quick warning, I'm getting the dreaded unstable internet connection. So if I drop off, just let you know. So apologies in advance. We've not got too much time left, so maybe some brief.
And sure enough, the vagaries of British internet, I think, have done their worst. Shall I take over? Yes. Okay. So the question Richard was about to ask was thinking about dementia treatments and technologies, is what strategies and initiatives you'd like to see them being used to implement them in the UK to accelerate their adoption at scale. So we talked a lot, or rather a few of you mentioned in your opening statements about the importance of implementation, the ability not just to look far down the future and think about what might be coming and to be ready for it, but to take the technologies, you know, whether diagnostics, biomarkers, treatments. I quite taken, John, by your point about the importance of treating people who are ill today, not just, you know, in some cases seriously ill today. There are, of course, technologies, treatments, other interventions that can make a difference. And you've already highlighted the huge amount of variability just in the use of imaging, for example. So thinking in the near future, what can we do to accelerate those interventions that we already know are effective in order to make them a much more equitably distributed and accessible across the UK today. So maybe, John, if I come to you on that one, because you've talked around that subject quite a bit already.
Thanks, James. Yeah, well, so there are, there are some centres of excellence, I think, that sort of do it well. So that one could go down that route, and there's a network of brain health clinics that I think are really, you know, state of the art in comparison to what's happening internationally about that. But I don't think that's really going to solve the problem, because how is that disseminated and how does that spread out? And I think there's been a failure of commissioning here, and I think that's partly because of the way dementia services are delivered, some in mental health trusts, whereas a lot of the diagnostics sits in acute hospital trusts, a lot of the biomarkers, and if we go down the immunotherapy route, the delivery of these is likely to be through the acute hospital trust, and they're kind of being commissioned in silos at the moment. And I think that commissioning really needs to be sort of jointly commissions, and I'm not meaning health and social care in that term, I'm meaning acute and mental health trusts, to deliver a dementia assessment pathway that includes access to all these validated and evidence-based biomarkers, because we really shouldn't be having a lottery postcode for sort of nice recommended diagnostics, I don't think. And I think that will be important, because the therapeutics pathway will follow from that, because same people, old age psychiatrists, neurologists, geriatricians, allied health professionals from both sides, etc., nursing staff, will be involved in the delivery of those treatments. And without stratifying people, knowing what their kind of disease is, we won't be able to offer them the right treatments down the road.
Great, thank you. And I should say, sorry, as we're coming to the end of the hour as well, one dimension of this, or a discussion we do want to draw out, is obviously taking account of where we are in the electoral cycle, and the fact there will be manifestos being written soon as well, and any kind of ideas you would want to leave on the record about areas which the political parties should be taking up as in terms of future commitments to service change. So, John, you may have covered that already in what you've just described, but give you a quick chance to add anything to the list, and then I'll come to Sasha, Matt, and Nadeem before we close.
No, I think I've said it, James. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Sasha.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, as John said, there are some very nice examples of sort of work going on to healthcare system sort of preparedness, things like the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, where they really take, best practice examples. They're putting a blood-based biomarker cognitive screening test in. They're seeing how that performs. I think these are really nice sort of practical examples of actually just getting on and doing something. Of course, the challenge there is that you then create kind of inequity, and then how do you scale from one to another? But I do still think that there is an opportunity in a model like this, because at the end of the day, I think you have to be able to demonstrate that a new process or a new methodology is actually working and having a positive impact. So maybe that sort of teaching by example approach is actually a way to go. I very much like the approach that Brain Health Scotland is taking, kind of disruptive approach with this brain health hub that they've set up, which is sort of how can we alleviate the pressure off the GP and create a sort of walk-in centre where anybody can go with concerns about their cognitive health or the cognitive status, and then get access to information and services, and potentially speed up a diagnosis if that's appropriate for them. So I do think that there are some examples around of people being kind of bold and a bit different, and perhaps this is really the way forward. But I think it's really about keeping it on the agenda, about setting targets, focusing on guidelines and making sure that, yes, we're talking about individual diseases. We can now identify these diseases that cause the symptoms. So let's focus on those. I think, guidelines need to be updated. I think the implementation of biomarkers needs to become much more routine, rather the rule rather than the exception. And I think that this will really help to streamline the diagnostic pathway. And yes, we're on the edge of a new treatment era, so we absolutely need to get ready for these anti-amyloid therapies which are coming.
Thank you. So I think what I'm hearing is it is about having a very consistent and high quality and easy to access kind of diagnostic service, or diagnostic and early care service. That is a good thing to do in its own right today, but will also kind of provide a platform for those treatments which we hope and expect are coming down the pipeline, but actually focusing on the here and now and what can be done. And thank you for that excellent example of what's happening in Scotland. We love a case study. Matt, and then Nadeem, and then we'll wrap up this hour.
Yeah, look, I'm not directly involved in clinical care in dementia, but what I see in other fields, like, for example, in cancer, is that the improvements of early diagnosis and better diagnostic centres has allowed the building alongside of that improved clinical trial programs, and a massive expansion in clinical trials over the last couple of decades, which is really what's built the big advances in cancer outcomes. And I think looking at that model as a way of driving forward what's happening in dementia would be an educational thing to do.
Terrific, thank you. Well, Nadeem, you are co-chairing the UK Dementia Mission. Hopefully, lots of food for thought for the Commission's work, but also for your mission's work. Is there anything you would like to reflect on that you've heard this morning? And please give your contribution to answering the question that I posed, and also thinking ahead to those manifestos.
No, thanks so much, James. And really, it was an excellent session with some great practical ideas. I think a fundamental question for the UK to ask itself is, what do we want to pioneer in and be world class in? And what are the foundations and tools that we have that give us a chance of being that? And I really believe this idea of a scalable at-home diagnostics funnel that leverages our expertise, world-class expertise in genomics, data sciences, digital technologies, could distinguish us as, first of all, a place that's willing to pioneer a nationwide approach, again, something that many other countries can't do. And then second, that will drive investment, company creation, and an appetite to do more research, including clinical trials in the UK. So I think we should think carefully about what is the thing that we could be the world's best at. And I believe the bricks that we have over the last 10, 20 years building around data sciences, digital technologies, genomics really gives us a real opportunity.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I am going to close this first hour's discussion there, but thank you to all our panelists for a really interesting, stimulating discussion. And I think, and I hope everybody who has been on the line to listen to that has enjoyed it. I am going to say thank you to John, to Sasha, Nadeem and Matt, and let you go. And then I think we'll just take a couple of minutes to welcome our next panelist. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to guide you through the second hour. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And thank you to all the panelists for a really interesting and stimulating first hour. So I hope we can live up to the second hour as we come on to the treatment and care section. I took from that some really optimistic views about, particularly from Nadeem Sarwar, around this inflection point that we're perhaps now entering the phase that oncology entered into maybe 20 years ago. And what we heard around the biomarkers and genomics and the more practical elements about how we implement the policies that we have and the guidance that we have actually gives you a little bit more confidence that we're going to make some strides in the next few years. And Nadeem's last comment, James, was very much in keeping with our previous commission last year, looking at what we can be really good at in this country. And we have well over 3/4 of what he's describing in place already. For the next step, we just need to, I think, socialize this, put it down as a major priority, and then look at how we bring that science and good clinical and social care together. And I hope this second session is going to be helpful across that. I'm pleased to welcome, and I hope they're all online, but I'll find out in a second, our three contributors for the next, which is Hilary Evans of the Alzheimer's Research UK, Professor Nick Fox, who I do see his name up there, Director of Dementia Research at UCL, and Professor Michael Hornberger, the Applied Dementia Research Professor from Norwich. We're going to go around you individually in a minute just to give a brief introduction to yourselves, and then I'll come back to each one of you to do a 2-minute introduction to what you see as the major issues in dementia care for care of people with dementia and treatments both present and in the future. And then I'm going to ask you to go back to a question we asked in the first session, which is around the sort of vision and ambition of the system when we come to that. So thank you for joining us. And Hilary, can I ask you to introduce yourself first, just very briefly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be part of this meeting and a great panel. So yeah, I'm Hilary Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of Alzheimer's Research UK, and I'm also co-chair of the Dementia Mission alongside Nadeem, who I think you heard from in the last session.
Thank you very much. And Nick, please.
Hi, I too am delighted to be on this panel. It's really exciting and interesting time. So I direct the Dementia Research Centre, which is a very clinical and research centre, very closely aligned to a specialist cognitive clinic here at the National Hospital for Neurology and at UCL. I'm also a group leader of the UK Dementia Research Institute at UCL, and I've been long-standing associations both with AI UK and Hilary and with the Alzheimer's Society, where I sit on their Research Strategy Council.
And finally, Michael.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me as well. Michael Homberger, Professor of Applied Dementia Research, which we're very interested in relating how care and I guess technology in particular impacts care in dementia. And I have also separate hats like Nick and the other people. One is that I should disclaim I'm a non-executive director of the Eastern Academic Health Sciences Network, so which is very interested, of course, in bringing technology into the NHS. And I also sit on the applied research collaboration of the NIHR.
Thank you. So, Hilary, would you like to commence with your sort of 2-minute introduction to this topic?
Sure. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, it's a really good time to have this conversation, and I think there's a huge amount of excitement actually at the moment, because we can all see that the first disease-modifying treatments for dementia are very close, potentially available if we have regulatory approval within the next 12 months. There's been a huge shift from where we've been in recent years. So I think the potential really to change the progression of this disease is a massive opportunity. And this is one of the things that's going to make the biggest impact on how we diagnose, how we treat, and how we look after people with dementia in the UK. But in order to make that change, we need to transform the system to be able to deliver. And I think that we feel at Alzheimer's Research UK now really is a window of opportunity, and we're doing a lot of work in recent years to lead up to that. Some of the work that we've done with the Royal College of Psychiatrists showed that only a third of memory clinics thought they would be ready to offer new treatments within the next year. So we know that new treatments will require access to different diagnostic tests, a new treatment pathway, different ways of administering treatment. We're talking about infusion sites. And we also know that as treatments come forward, more people will want to come forward for a diagnosis, which is a good thing. We need to improve the way that we diagnose and diagnostic rates, but that's going to put pressure on a system that's already pretty overwhelmed. So we need to ensure that clinicians and services can cope with these changes in their practice with extra patients, and that we can then properly support people with dementia through this. So we know there's a huge unmet need. There's going to be really high public expectations to access these new treatments. We've already seen from media coverage, even in recent weeks, the amount of interest that there is in new drugs coming forward, and there being a treatment for dementia which currently doesn't exist. And we see that through our information line to the public, huge spikes in terms of the numbers of calls and people asking when this drug is going to be available, what it might look like, whether they can fly relatives to the USA for treatments, all these sorts of things that we are grappling with. So we need to understand what this can look like. We need to engage with the public so that they understand what is available when and who is suitable for some of these treatments. And I think that the UK is a really good place to be having these conversations. We know we've got an incredible dementia research landscape, and we've historically had real global leadership, I think, in this area. We showed leadership from the G8 summit in 2013, set up a number of really fantastic initiatives. So it really would be a lost opportunity if UK patients didn't benefit from the first treatments coming through. So we need to ensure that I think all different parts of the system line up, because actually this, as I said at the start, could be a really exciting time, and we need to ensure that we can turn what is an exciting time into real delivery for people with dementia now and in the future.
Thank you. And you bring up some of the issues that came up in the first session around access and about the variability of what's on offer and the readiness of the system to cope. So thank you for emphasizing those as well in this second session. Nick, can I come to you?
Yes, certainly. I think it is a very exciting time. It's a time of great change. I'd like to hope in this sort of 2-minute vision bit that we would make some progress towards ending the nihilism that has been around dementia for decades. A sense in that there was not much you could do about dementia. Perhaps people didn't even really want a diagnosis, and it's actually that the system couldn't cope. So I think there is great grounds for optimism that we can change that. We will have to completely change the mindset that there is a point to a timely diagnosis, and we have to move away from detection of dementia to diagnosing a dementia. We'll have to have a whole new system of delivering care, which will be much more multidisciplinary. And I think we are very well placed in the UK to make a real contribution to how we can deliver that effectively, how we can link clinical and research and wide access to data for the greatest good. But I think I can't say those things without being honest about the state of the current situation. My patients, often their families, tell me how hard it is to access care, huge delays in getting a diagnosis, the way that they get assessed and then they are discharged from services to be only to come back if they hit crisis. And that means our system is very, very inefficient. People are inappropriately being admitted to accident and emergency, costing huge amounts of resource. That we need to have systems that do not discharge people, but actually carry them from detection to diagnosis all the way through to care, through all those transitions. And if we add on top of that the layer of how we're going to prepare for disease-modifying therapies, these are massive challenges, but they should be challenges which come with hope rather than with despair. But it will require much more investment, huge investment to get anywhere near dementia being considered like many of the other diseases where we've made progress.
Thank you, Nick. And I think you do make an important point that we're going to come back to, I hope, later on policy. And we're talking about this is within 18 months of an election. There'll be manifestos. What are people going to put in for what is a very large clinical problem that we're dealing with at a population level lasting many years, as we've also heard earlier on today. Michael, your chance now.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree, it's a very exciting time now, particularly with the disease-modifying treatments, the pharmaceutical treatments coming through. I think for me, one of the key issues is how will we measure actually how things change, particularly if we can identify people before they develop symptoms, which you might have heard in a diagnostic session already with the new blood tests coming out. I think this will be an enormous challenge. How do we monitor people throughout the development of the disease? How do we therefore tailor the treatment as best as possible to individual patients? And this means also looking across different socioeconomic classes, which will be a challenge in itself. And we can talk about this later. So to me, to have these new measures, which we really need to think about, is a key aspect. One aspect of this would be technology. And the great thing is, at the moment, for me, a lot of things come together in terms of drug development, but also that technologically we have enormous tools in our toolbox, which we could deploy. But how we can regulate them, how we can use them, whether they're useful is really, really important questions which we need to tackle, especially in the sensor technology. And of course, everybody talks about artificial intelligence these days. We just need to see how we can actually manage that. With that comes as well, how do we want to standardize measures for treatment and care? And that's still a huge challenge across the system, because if you want to use that data, particularly to offer better treatment and care for people, then better standardization is needed, and particularly if one takes what's called a big data approach. But similarly, we need to also not forget to take maybe a small data approach, which really, how do individuals change over time and have trajectories? And that would be really important, I think, to have a look at this, in particular in regards to technology, which allows self-monitoring of people, and this will become an interesting, I guess, aspect to again explore how is this feasible. Is this good for people to self-monitor, for example, their cognitive health or their outcomes of their treatments, and how does this fed back into the services? Finally, I just want to say the other key issue is how do we integrate services better? And I really want to talk about this later. In lots of our research, we work between the healthcare, social care, and the police, and it just becomes obvious that dealing with the same people, but very differently, have completely different systems in place, which creates, as Nick mentioned, enormous challenges and frustrations for the people with dementia and their families.
Thanks, Michael. And you do bring up things that we will be coming back to later on in this session. If I can keep with you just a moment, one question we're asking all the panelists today is around where you see things will be in 10 years' time when it comes to the state of diagnostics, treatment and care. What's your sort of vision for that 10-year sort of trajectory?
Yes, I think to me, I think the blood test will very likely become available. In which form, I think that's a big question to ask. And when do we actually profile people as to whether they have an increased risk or not? So I think in 10 years' time, I think people will use this. The other thing is in terms of treatments, I think it's really exciting to identify people much earlier, to have actually the treatments in place. But the final thing, and again, we might come back later to this in terms of manifestos, and Alzheimer's Research UK has done so much in this already, is how do we get much more awareness across how people can actually prevent dementia or reduce their risk for dementia, to put it better. I think that would be, for me, in 10 years' time, if we have these things in place, I think we're in a very, very strong position for dementia.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And Hilary, I'll just go to you next for where would you like to be in 10 years? Where would the Alzheimer's Society like to be?
Or Alzheimer's Research UK. So I think in 10 years, we've got the ability to completely transform what the life of someone with dementia could look like, but also, I guess, to sort of Michael's point, the lives of the kind of UK public looks like when we talk about dementia, because I think we're starting to get to the point where a lot of the messages that we've been talking about for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, which have been around, dementia is caused by underlying diseases. It's not an inevitable part of aging. There are things that you can do to reduce your risk. There are lifestyle factors. So actually there are conversations across the life course about dementia. This isn't just conversations with people in later life at the point where they've got some worries around their cognition or their memory. And so actually what we want to see is a transformation of people in early and midlife actually understanding there are things that they can do to reduce their potential risk of developing disease that cause dementia. And then as we go through, we start to detect much, much earlier. We start to then, from that detection, we understand who is at the higher risk, and therefore people we can have different conversations with, which we can monitor people, we can ensure that we can do some of the more invasive tests on the right people, and we can sign people up, ensure that people play a part in the research as well. Because I think one of the big challenges is actually, as Nick was saying, there's not been a lot we can offer patients. So actually the fact that we could change the infrastructure in the UK to be a more vibrant place to run clinical trials, and therefore offer people in the next few years a better chance to be involved in clinical trials, which allows early access to innovative medicines as they come through, I think is something that we'd really like to see. And then that kind of end goal in 10 years from now, ultimately we need to see a system where people get the right diagnosis at the right time, and then the ability to access the right medicines that can change the course of their disease. And I think that will be truly transformational, but I think it absolutely is achievable in 10 years if we do the right things now.
Yeah, getting those basic things in place first, and as Nick has illustrated already, with the variability and the fact that we don't have that yet, it makes that sort of vision more difficult to envisage, I guess, but we can do that. In terms of internationally, obviously other countries have done different things. There are various projects in Europe, etc. But I'm always drawn to Japan, where they seem to be much more inclusive about how they're approaching dementia and getting a lot more people within the drug trials and research community through their Orange program. Nick, what's your vision?
Okay, well, it's great to have a 10-year vision. So I'd like us to totally change that nihilism I talked about. I think that there's some good comparisons with cancer. So when people get admitted to hospital or present to their GP with a potential, this could be cancer, they have a 2-week wait. Doctors do not want to miss a cancer. The opposite is currently true with dementia. People do not make diagnoses. They worry that this could be acute confusion. It's not really dementia, but what have we got to offer? So we need to totally change that. The delay can be years before you get a diagnosis, and there isn't any urgency currently in dementia diagnosis. I think we may move, if these disease-modifying therapies really show their promise, we may move to approach where time is brain. The delaying therapy may mean that people are further along and either may miss a window for treatment or that they have lost brain function, brain cells that are irretrievable. So I think that moving to diagnosis that is specific, not detection, and moving it earlier and recognizing that it's important to make a diagnosis is the first piece. And to stay with my cancer analogy, imagine any one of us or our loved one going and seeing a doctor and being told you've got a diagnosis of cancer, and that then be the end of the conversation. We'd want to know what was the cause. What was the cause? Is it breast cancer, a brain cancer? Is it? And that is just to show how stark the difference is with dementia, because people get told they've got dementia. They often don't get told they've got Alzheimer's disease. And so we need that to be more specific to be able to guide treatments. Obviously, in some late stage, people have a mixture of diseases and it may be impossible, but we should be seeking to understand what the underlying causes are in that diagnosis. I think we want treatments earlier, and we will need new starting and stopping criteria. And the real vision for 10 years would be that we have care that is much more fit for purpose, that has joined up systems, that people don't feel abandoned, that we recognize the huge place that support for families and carers can do in keeping people at home and actually saving society money, but also doing what people want. And I think we will need a radical rethinking about how we see end-of-life care, and that we empower people to be part of decisions about how much care they want, how much treatment they want, and how long they want their life potentially prolonged at a state when they have very little quality of life. Because it's that end period that is often incredibly distressing for so many people and so many families.
Thanks very much, Nick. Time is brain will stick, I think, today. Thank you. Keith, are we going to go on to the first question? And I'll let you lead on this. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And yes, that will stick with me. So the first question is about, it begins a sort of some question around implementation and the sort of, what do you see as the primary technical and evidence type barriers, including but things like funding, regulation, professional and clinical behaviours, integration? Do you think those sorts of things are going to hinder the access and adoption of the various biopharmaceutical treatments and technologies? So what are those primary barriers? And if I'd like to add, then when there are, and particularly with Hilary here, then how, initiatives like the mission, whether they're sufficiently connected to those who are responsible for implementation. So with some of those sorts of barriers in mind. So Nick, do you want to have a go at that first?
Yeah, well, I think there are lots. Again, sorry to start with the most simplistic and often the most difficult. There will need to be more funding. Let's just say that there. I think we will detection, diagnosis, delivery of new therapies, monitoring of those therapies will all require more resource. It will also require more training, but I think we need to take a rather more innovative view of what multidisciplinary teams can do and recognize that, particularly working in a team, there are some things that are conventionally only, in many places, only done by doctors and that don't need to be. To give you one example, doing a lumbar puncture to get a CSF examination, historically that used to be just neurologists and acute medical teams that would be doing those sort of things. But actually, we for example, have a very effective CSF clinic that's run by a nurse who is fantastic, and we can combine nurse led counseling for somebody while they have their CSF done. So there are smart ways that you can get round some of the capacity barriers, but they will still need a new approach to training and building teams that can do much more of this wraparound support. You talked about barriers that would include regulation and professional clinical, and that integration. I think giving people certain rights or setting out, maybe this is a manifesto thing, in that you have that you wouldn't have to wait a number of years for a diagnosis. I don't know what the period that we would put, and you may not be appropriate for treatment, but you should have a minimum period where you would be assessed and decide whether or not a symptomatic treatment, risk factor management, or disease modifying therapy was appropriate for you. At the moment, I think there's very little in the way of any rights that we have for that. And I think that would be very, very, very important. And we do absolutely need a major barrier is making sure that our systems join up properly.
Okay. And do you think, I mean, it feels to me, and I'm not a specialist, but it feels to me that there's enormous, no doubt could always be bigger, effort around research and less effort around what practically will be needed to get the various diagnostics or treatments into practice. Is that fair?
I think it varies a little bit, but if behind your question is this sense that we do research, but then we don't spend enough time making it get that leap from research into practice, I would agree with you in that. I think we develop a new brain scan or a new test, and it doesn't make that jump into practice. And we need to have a way of accelerating that adoption and implementation and making that very, very important. I do think we need to think about the challenges. For this inquiry, we should be thinking about while they are linked, the challenge of the disease modifying therapies is a huge challenge. But alongside that, even if we didn't have those disease modifying therapies, there are multiple challenges at every stage. And so I think both need to be addressed.
Okay, that's helpful. Michael, from your point of view, the barriers and...
I think someone has a question or raised their hand. Do you want to answer that? Do you want to address that?
Jill, sorry.
I just thought I'd interject there because, Nick, I think it was you who earlier said this was going to need a huge investment. And I wondered if you had any reflections on how that might be addressed, and clearly NICE's role in that. Where are we going to go with some of these expensive drugs? Are we going to effectively prioritize the groups that have them at first? Or do you have any other thoughts about that investment requirement?
Well, so there's both investment. I don't know where the investment is going to come from. I think the NHS and the UK has done a good job in cost and risk sharing in the past for introduction of new therapies. And I think there are lessons to be learned from other brain diseases where there were no disease modifying therapies and there was nihilism, and yet those have come about and we've managed to adopt them. I suspect this will have to start initially in specialist centres to get the systems going and work out how we can safely deliver and monitor people, we need to recognize the role of much more efficient imaging that we can do. I think we can do a much better job on that for safety monitoring. We can do a better job in triaging people, and we should, from the very outset of the introduction of disease-modifying therapies, make it almost part of a requirement that we capture all the data, whether it's people's blood test, how they did, whether they had a side effect, so that the NHS then becomes almost the best data series set real-life clinical trial that will be then very powerful.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, Jill, whether I've properly answered your question.
I think you made some great points, and that was really helpful, and should probably let Keith get back to the sequence, or we'll run out of time.
No, it's very helpful. Michael, barriers to uptake and the like.
Yes, yeah. Well, similar to Nick, I think funding is absolutely critical for this. And if we compare ourselves to the big diseases, other big diseases clearly are underfunded. I think I want to extend to what Nick said and say in particular funding towards the care side. I think the vast majority of funding goes towards more the diagnosis and treatment, which is very important. I don't want to divert this, but I think we need to have much better funding for the care side, because the evidence base very often for care practices is patchy, let's be honest, and can be really improved. And I think that will become a real, a real issue in particular once we have these disease modifying therapies now that will slow down the disease, so people will stay much, much longer with the disease. And I think in particular for technologies, we need to have much better evidence base, which technologies work, how do they work, how acceptable they are. And that leads me then to the regulatory aspect, of course, in terms of, if you talk about technologies, you need to talk about privacy, data protection, which are all issues we're grappling with all the time. And it's this kind of balance then to strike between people, once they're discharged in the community, between them having the greatest autonomy while having at the same time the greatest safety. And how do we balance that out is a big issue for me to deal with, what we deal with every day. So those are the key barriers. In terms of the other key barriers, and again, Nick mentioned this already, is the integration. Not only integration within the NHS, but integration with other services. There is now a much better effort to do this with social care. But again, all other services in the community, very often they feel also very disconnected from everything, and everybody deals again with the same person. So addressing those would be my first thoughts on this. Okay. I can see Nick has already a comment on this. I'm curious now, Nick.
I just wanted a clarification, if I might. I think by that you meant, in terms of when you were saying much more money is spent on diagnostics and treatment than care, you meant in terms of research.
Sorry, yes.
I think you meant to say that, but didn't, because actually the vast, the 26 billion or 35 billion, depending on how you estimate, cost to the UK economy, diagnostics and treatment at the moment are absolutely trivial. They get lost in a rounding error. It's formal and informal care. And I mean, one of the things that this inquiry might like to look into is this is what my families tell me when they are starting to think about somebody going into care, and they may spend several years in care, that will cost, I mean, literally 50,000, 70,000 a year, which is absolutely phenomenal. So it's the cost of care that drives this equation currently. Now, disease-modifying therapies with their cost may change that slightly, but we need to be seeing how we can gain quality of life rather than just years to life.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying, Nick. Yes, absolutely. I was talking about the research side. You're absolutely right. The costs for in terms of the care, yeah, it's completely disproportionate the other way around. I think in terms of the research evidence, the evidence base for what works in care, I think that's where, that's my point really. But thank you for clarifying.
And I know
that.
Hilary
That
wants to come
important.
in, but I just think it's very salutary when you think about, I mean, these figures are slightly out of date, but when I looked into it a while back, you know, for every £10 that dementia costs the UK economy, it's less than a penny gets spent on research. So it's like the roof's leaking, and what we're doing is just moving the buckets around.
Okay, those are very helpful comments. I'm conscious Hilary wants to come in anyway, so if we can deal with the sort of the question as well, if that's okay. And I wondered also if you could stick your co-chair of the mission hat on as well when you're sort of thinking about this, and you know, in connection to who you think you deal with or who you think is responsible for implementation at the end of the day.
Okay, just a few questions. I think yeah. I was going to come in just on what Nick was saying, and actually it links to answering this question as well. So I think one of the things in terms of kind of barriers and regulators need to take into account the huge societal social care costs, informal care costs when you are looking at a treatment for dementia, which currently they don't normally do. So I think that because that's where the costs are incurred, we know that I think it's 25% of hospital beds, people over 60 are taken up currently by someone with dementia. So the costs are huge. We know that the costs of new drugs are relatively high. We know that, you know, the first in-class drugs are going to have modest impact on any sort of budget, no matter how you kind of do that equation. But I think that we have to look to regulators in terms of speed, in terms of, you know, making a decision about, you know, is this somewhere we want to ensure that our patient population have the access to this first generation of drugs, and what message does it send if actually we've got you know, safe and effective drugs that our patient population can't access. So I think that those are all certainly potential barriers. I think in terms of kind of my mission hat, I guess the missions were set up as life science missions within government. And I think the Dementia Mission, and part of my agreeing to co-chair this, is that we need to push outside of the sort of mission focus just on kind of a life sciences mission and sort of reinvigorating UK life sciences, because we can do all of the work around life sciences and ensuring that the UK is a better place to do clinical trials, which is going to be good for patients in lots of ways in short and long term. But that's only going to work if we can have the ability to kind of get hold of some of the levers to change things for patients. So that is around conversations with regulators, that is conversations with NHS. So I guess where we are in that, we are having those conversations. We are looking at publicly releasing a sort of roadmap for the Dementia Mission at the end of July at the AIC. So we're working towards that now, having a number of conversations with people we will want to partner with. So I think one of the things that I'm keen with the mission is that we join up a number of the existing initiatives, so whether that's from a research perspective all the way through to delivery, and who those partners are. I think that the kind of political will and leadership is really critical here. So I'm at the moment having conversations with sort of those senior in government and across other political parties as well, as to what that looks like, to ensure that we have that kind of cross-party support given where we are in the electoral cycle, because this is long term, and it will need funding and it will need continued leadership. And if we don't have that, we won't be able to change any of the systems, because I think, as others have rightly said, the funding and the costs are huge, and we are talking about a sort of system change, but we are talking about doing something that doesn't exist. So it's not talking about necessarily changing a system, but we're bringing in a completely new sort of diagnostic pathway into a system which at the moment we know the NHS is hugely overwhelmed. And what does that look like? What does that look like in primary care? What does that look like for the individual? But I do think there is an opportunity here. I think, as Michael mentioned, the wealth of data that we have in the UK, that actually this is, it is somewhere where actually we could, if we got this right, that would be an incredible thing for the UK to be able to deliver. So I think, for me, I want to be able to use the Dementia Mission and the platform that brings to ensure that we've got buy-in. But the question of getting extra funding at this point for anything is challenging. But I think if you can, if you're not doing it for dementia, which is the leading cause of death, the huge cost behind it, then I think that, we've got a pretty good argument lined up in order to make that change happen. And I don't think there's going to be a government out there that want to see patients essentially banging doors down to get access to these new treatments. And I think you're going to see a huge amount of anger from charities like my own and across the section Alzheimer's Society and patients if we don't get this right. So I think that as a charity, we've done a lot of work since I've been involved, which is almost 10 years, around preparing the system, doing a lot of sort of policy work behind the scenes and commissions and task force in this space, and bringing together NHS leaders. And I've been doing that for the last 7 or 8 years around a dementia access task force. So there have been sort of policy work behind the scenes that has played a role in terms of just getting this mission off the ground. So it was something that we've been campaigning for. So I think the fact that we have got the mission, that there is extra funding behind the mission, so there's an extra £95 million behind the mission so far, but we're looking to build on that. So we're looking to get extra investment because that's really just the start. So yeah, I'm very open to those conversations around broadening out the role of the mission in terms of delivery. Yes.
Okay, that's very helpful. That's me, Mike, I think.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks, Hilary, for explaining a bit more about the mission. I think it's important people understand where it is and where it's going with the work you're doing, and well done. I'm just going to take us back to the clinical care pathways, and Michael, you mentioned a little bit about this in your previous answers, particularly as we now move into an era where we're perhaps going to have more choices of treatment. If I could start with you, what sort of support do you think we need to put in place to help health and social care actually implement these pathways so that we get a consistent and high quality care?
Yeah, I think consistent is the key word, I think, for me. I think the other one is integration. And that's already, of course, happening a lot within services that now health and care, social care services are now much more integrated. But I think that's what we really need to target. Again, if we talk about, and Hilary just mentioned the data, yeah, I completely agree. There is huge amounts of data around, but it's not integrated. And to provide this best care, I think we need, this kind of computerized decision support systems, which can really help the clinicians or the social care workers to make much better decisions how to help people and really use this data for providing the best care possible. I find it interesting that you do not mention actually here, Nick mentioned is the biggest amount of money, of course, is on informal care. One question is, do we want to bring the informal carers somehow into this as well? And it's a question back to you, I think, whether it's much, that's much more than a grassroots type approach to really look at how do we involve informal carers in these pathways as well, because they very often feel quite confused, especially with the continued healthcare system, which can be very, very challenging for people to navigate. So I think those are the main issues I want to raise.
Thank you, Mike. And we will be covering in a future session the role both of carers and patients in service design. And I think, having talked a lot late about new digital services, if you don't get that right with the people you're trying to direct it to at the beginning, it inevitably fails or doesn't work as well as it could. Nick, where do you think we should be focused?
Well, if I may, I'd like to pick up on that last point, which is around, we've talked a lot about partnerships and joined up care. I mean, the most important partner is the patient's partner. And people often feel incredibly isolated and abandoned and unsupported. And that's a very bad thing, clearly, but it's also short-sighted of us, because supporting the person who's supporting the person with dementia means that they're less likely to have an emergency crisis admission. And that's what, as Hilary was saying, 25% of beds in hospital, 80%, more than 80% of our residential care beds are people with cognitive impairment or dementia. I mean, your chance of being in residential care at aged 80 is completely different if you've got cognitive impairment or not, to the factor of many times more likely, like 20 times more likely. So I think working out what we can do to support people in their homes when that's possible would be a huge investment, and part of hugely effective investment. And part of that is actually about the well-being and the support and the knowledge that you can give people so they don't feel lost, they do feel that somebody's looking after them, and that they can be signposted. That really would make a big difference. People so struggle with knowing where to turn for help. Even filling in the forms is just beyond people. That should be a priority, that nobody should fail to get support and care simply because they cannot manage to fill in the form themselves. That, if that's a low-level promise, we should make that one. And I'm just going to put it out there, the most neglected, the most discriminated group in our society in terms of dementia is somebody who's on their own. They much more so than any other disparity.
Yeah, it's a very lonely place. In my former life as a GP, they were the most difficult patients to have to support. I'm not saying to actually deal with, but just to support. It was inevitably an uphill struggle to get them any services of meaningful value until actually they were usually admitted for residential care. Hilary, you're on mute, I think. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned before. I mean, I think we are talking about a new pathway here. I think we are talking about there are ways of scaling up things like brain health clinics, but actually, sort of to Nick's point, how do we reach the hardest to reach? How do we reach people who are on their own, or who have carers who are completely overwhelmed in terms of them coming into a system? So I do think that we need to have something that is going out there and reaching the right people at the right time, and that is a big challenge in terms of the population that we are trying to reach. And I think that one of the things I'm very mindful on is around the mission is we can have a focus around involving people in research, we can have a focus on getting new drugs to the right people as they come through, but we know who's the most effective at probably getting those new drugs in the right places, who probably live very near to big university hospitals, or who are fighting for access to clinical trials. So I think that there's a big challenge in how we do that, and I think that it's a difficult time in some ways to be having these conversations, but actually it's also a time to think differently. And I think that in dementia we do need to think differently, because it's not like a cancer pathway, it's not like a cardiovascular pathway. There are elements of both that you could replicate, but I think when you're talking about a population where you are trying to detect and diagnose at quite an early stage, but often to hard to reach individuals in later life, that comes with some unique challenges, and we need to be really clear about what that can look like and what we're trying to detect and diagnose at which point, because I think that dictates what that pathway needs to look like. But I think, as others have said, actually, if you've got someone that can advocate and who can navigate some of these pathways, then fine. But it should be something, while we're designing this, that we're doing that with people and patients and their carers in a co-design, because actually if it doesn't work for someone who can't then fill in forms because we're asking so much of individuals in order to kind of access some of those pathways, then actually that isn't going to work. So I think that these are all the sort of big things that we need to grapple with, but if we don't get that right, then it's not going to lead to access to the treatments we want to see.
Just as a supplementary, do you think the new ICS bodies are going to be in a position to do those things better than we have, and using their primary care networks and using people across the community, and not necessarily traditionally like a GP or something, but other areas that can help?
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, and I think we need to think outside of sort of current structures and different ways of getting to patient populations. And I think there's some interesting things you can learn from, you know, how we got out to individuals in COVID and those networks. And I've been talking to Kate Bingham, as you'd expect, around some of those learnings, which I think could be really interesting if you applied then that to dementia.
Okay, we'll move on because we've got 2 more questions to fit in before the end of our time. Jill, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I think you've all talked about the public and the need to engage with them, to change the mindset, raise awareness of new treatments, specific diagnostic terminology, and the risk of anger, I think, if the new treatments aren't available for them. So in that context, my question is, what strategies do we need to start raising awareness and educating and empowering people about the impact of dementia, its natural history, etc., and all the potential for things to change? How are we going to go about that? Who would like to start? Perhaps Hilary?
Yeah, should I take that and start with? Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of what we've been doing at Alzheimer's Research UK. And I would say we have shifted things in the last 10 years. So I mean, I guess I came into this role and I previously worked at Age Concern and Age UK. So I've worked on dementia, I worked on sort of dementia care and older people's issues for a number of years there. And I'd underestimated the lack of kind of public understanding or knowledge around dementia. And as a medical research funder, you want to go out with a big fundraising appeal to raise lots of money for medical research. It's very hard to do that if people think that the condition you're working on isn't caused by any disease or is there anything you can do about it. So actually a lot of the work that we've been doing and the campaigns that we've been doing that a number of people on this panel have been involved in have literally just been around raising awareness, trying to break down stigma and getting people to talk about the condition is huge. And I think we are going some way towards that. We still know it's about 1 in 5 people think that dementia is caused by disease. It's still that inevitable part of aging. It's something that people don't want to talk about, even in families, in my own family. I've had far too many people who've I've lost to dementia and 2 aunts who currently have dementia. Families still don't really want to get to that point where actually they are talking about someone having dementia. There's lots of conversations around the side of it. And I think that that's the thing that we really need to crack. If we're talking about kind of awareness, understanding, I do think awareness has shifted. And in that last 10 years, you can, just the number of conversations, news stories, actually celebrities coming out and talking about their own condition. Sir Terry Pratchett was one of our patrons, and he talked about his diagnosis of dementia. And to Nick's point earlier, he previously had cancer, and he'd said, when I had cancer, people flocked towards me, asked what they could do to help. I had this whole community. I had doctors, I had appointments. He was diagnosed with a form of Alzheimer's disease, PCA. And he said, I just felt like I was out there on my own. No one knew what to say to me. There was nowhere to go. There was no doctor's appointments. It was, well, sort of come back when you're dying and there's nothing we do. And what he did do was give us £1 million and said, actually, research has to be part of that solution. But I think people like Barbara Windsor and her husband, Scott, who's been campaigning with us for a number of years, actually, those kind of icons talking about the condition and being really open and being comfortable to be photographed and filmed, rather than hearing that we've lost someone to Alzheimer's disease and no one really wants to look at that, or they think it's just about memory and actually no one sees as Nick was saying, the really dreadful part of this condition and what life looks like. And I think that is what we are trying to do as a charity. We were one of the first charities in the world to show what this condition looked like, and I think we have to be really honest with the public. And it's awful, and it's a devastating condition, and it leads to death. And I think the questions that we're often asked are, well, does it really lead to death? Or, kind of how bad can it be? And I think so we do need to continue to do that if we're going to make progress. But I think that a lot of those conversations are ongoing, and I think it's taking the public with you. But if you look at cancer, if you look at HIV and AIDS, the moment that you had treatments that changed the course of the disease, stigma started to break down because there's something that you could do. So I do think that sort of changes the dial a little bit here. And I think that there's also a piece where actually, if you've got a pathway, if there is a clinical trial that you can be part of, if you are monitored, if there are things that you can do, and we've launched a sort of brain health tool, so things that you can do to reduce your risk, even if you're a carer and you think actually things I can do to reduce my risk or try and help my own well-being to sort of cope with the responsibilities. Those are all positive things that we can be talking about. And just to check, because you implied this, do you have data that is tracking ongoing trends in public awareness yet? We do, yeah. So we've got Dementia Attitudes Monitor. So I think we're doing another one this summer actually. So we do track all of that, which is fascinating. Well, that's really, really interesting. And Nick, anything to add? Anything more we need to be doing?
Well, I completely agree with Hilary. I mean, I think there are very few medical conditions that actually change the fabric of society and become part of discourse. You know, HIV did, cancer did, COVID did, and dementia is doing that now. It's in lots of films, it's in television series. It never used to be. It's in the papers. We have people like Bruce Willis talking about a young onset dementia. We had Terry Pratchett. So I think things are changing. The thing that will really, really change things, that will accelerate that, is when we can convince people there is something you can do about it. So previously, people didn't come out because of stigma. I think that's much less of an issue. I agree with Hilary, but I think there's still a sense is, well, what can you do about it? And the message we need to get over to people is, look, there are treatments, and the disease-modifying therapies will, when they are introduced, I do not think they will bankrupt the NHS, because there'll be a tiny, tiny proportion of people that will be eligible. But what they might do is change a lot of people's view that there is something that can be done. And what we have to have ready is for that swell of people who really feel, actually, I need a timely diagnosis, or my husband does, or my auntie does. And if we're not ready, the system will fall over. I don't think what will be the real challenge will necessarily be those first few infusions. It will be dealing with everything around it.
And will it help the public narrative if we change from talking about dementia as a broad, all-encompassing term and start being more specific in the words we use?
Yeah. In my view, hugely, to say to people, look, dementia is not just one thing, just like cancer is not just one thing. In my view, a label of dementia is no more appropriate in a way than saying that somebody has got skin failure rather than saying they've got eczema or melanoma. Dementia just means brain failure. And that almost, by its very nature, is nihilistic. There are diseases, there are risk factors, there are things you can do about it, and you can get support. But we cannot diagnose all these people if we're not going to be also providing support for that wife, husband, daughter, and often is women who are providing that support, for them to feel abandoned and isolated as well. So we have a great opportunity to change that public discourse and awareness, but we have to make sure that we're ready for it. Otherwise, just raising awareness and saying, yep, get a diagnosis. Oh, I'm sorry, your next appointment is in a year. Yes. And then you'll be told you have dementia and here's a leaflet, but we're not going to give you even a follow-up appointment.
That's a good point, isn't it? There's raising awareness, but there's managing appropriately expectations in that context too. Michael, anything more to add to this debate?
Yeah, I think they summarized it pretty well. I think the only thing I would say is then the whole risk reduction of dementia and having awareness for this. I'd love to see a public health campaign towards this, similar to what we've seen for smoking, which here in this country, or for skin cancer in Australia, where these public health campaigns shifted people's awareness that they can actually do something already in their midlife to reduce their risk for dementia in the future. And that's really well established now as well. So I'd love to see that as a public health campaign, but otherwise I agree with everything that's been said before.
Thank you. Trained in public health, I support that.
James, I'm going to ask you to ask your pithy question and then perhaps just sum up where we're going policy-wise with this.
Well, indeed. Thank you for a really fascinating discussion. I mean, this point about hopefulness versus hopelessness, I think, is incredibly well made. If I could ask you all just to very quickly, 20 seconds, what you'd like to see in party manifestos that would actually make a difference in the short term for better dementia treatment and care. Perhaps I could go Hilary, Michael, Nick.
Sure. Hi, James. So if in 20 seconds, I'd say in manifestos, a recommitment to continuing the dementia mission and the funding behind that. I think I would also say they need to be bold and say, actually, we want to ensure everyone gets a accurate, timely diagnosis of dementia and access to treatments as they are licensed through the healthcare system. And I think we should be really bold and say we want the UK to be one of the first places where patients are going to routinely get the right diagnosis and treatment for their disease.
So a pathway, an actual pathway. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the only thing otherwise is I would love to see more awareness in terms of dementia, which we talked already about. I think increase clearly the research funding, in particular towards care research, where the vast majority of people would spend most of their time, and focus on the carers or the family as another pillar of dementia. That would be, for me, the key issues.
Thanks, Michael. Nick?
A timely diagnosis when people want it, a specific diagnosis, and that they won't get dismissed and discharged, and support for those who care for or care about somebody with dementia.
Thank you. All excellent points, and thank you for a brilliant session. Mike, I'll leave a hand over to you to close.
Thank you to our contributors, Michael, Nick and Hilary, and thank you to the early contributors in session one. You got us off to a brilliant start on this part of our commission, the first of three sessions that we're going to hold. I think you've laid out before us some of the visions and hopes for the future, some of the practical issues that we're left dealing with at the moment. And actually, I think an honest appraisal, be it one of a hopeful one, that actually this is something of its time that needs focus and direction, and that political parties probably will neglect it at their doom, because it is one of the major issues facing certainly our society and probably Western society as we go forward. Thank you all very much. This will be available on YouTube as a recording, so please recommend it to others if you think they'll be interested, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.